Much of Europe's civil strife of the 19th and 20th centuries can be traced back to one point in the late 18th century. Everything from major reforms of the British government to the Cold War itself all have a common link, and were birthed from a defining moment in French, European, and eventually even world history, the French Revolution. In the late 1700s, the French people got sick of the nobles and rich people having all the power and revolted, then chopped off a bunch of heads. The end. If you enjoyed this episode of the Infographics Show, don't forget to like, share, and okay, fine. If you really insist, we'll dive a bit deeper into one of the most important moments in human history. The 18th century had been a tumultuous one for Europe's major powers. France and Britain had once more resumed their favorite hobby, killing each other as frequently and as violently as possible as they clashed for power across the world stage. When the King of Spain died in 1700, he left no obvious heir to the throne, leading to a conflict that dragged in both France and Britain and threatened to completely upend the balance of power across Europe. Then 40 years later, the two countries were at it again, being pulled into the War of Austrian Succession, when Archduchess Maria Theresa was denied the Austrian throne because in those days women were good for looking at and not much else, certainly not ruling. France and Britain would continue the conflict even after Maria Theresa took the throne, with their colonies fighting overseas and leading to the defeat of French forces in India in 1763. In 1778, the fledgling United States decided that unlike every other British colony, it wasn't having any more of this taxation without representation nonsense, and very rudely declared a war of independence. France, seeing an opportunity to really stick it to Britain, immediately backed the rebels, who would have been utterly crushed without their help, a fact many Americans have forgotten. All these wars left France in pretty dire financial shape, and it wasn't helped that King Louis XVI decided that amidst 2 decades of poor harvests and droughts, he'd go ahead and spend money like it was going out of style. As bread prices climbed and the nation realized it was in very serious financial trouble, the king responded by increasing taxes, and the peasantry saw very little relief from an increasingly desperate domestic situation, with most of that revenue going to pay off debts or funding the very expensive hobby of killing the British. With no other option left to them, the peasants began rioting and looting, staging labor strikes and refusing to work until the king did something about the worsening situation. You know things are bad when governments start thinking about actually taxing rich people, and in 1786, Louis XVI's Controller General, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, created a financial reform package that would include a universal land tax, which would not exempt the upper classes from paying, as had historically been done. The proposal that rich people pay their fair share during a time of financial crisis went over about as well as you'd expect, and the aristocratic classes immediately began talking about their own revolt. In a bid to garner support for this desperately needed tax, the king summoned the Estates General, an assembly of France's clergy, nobility, and middle classes. The peasants weren't invited because they were probably too busy farming cow dung or whatever peasants do. The Estates General hadn't been called since 1614, and in the nearly 200 years since, the demographics of the assembly had dramatically changed. Whereas the aristocrats once made up the bulk of the membership, now the non-aristocratic members made up a whopping 98% of the assembly. Yet they could still be overruled by the 2% of clergy and nobility. Shockingly, the middle class had a slight problem with this arrangement, and so they immediately began to campaign for equal representation and a complete abolishment of the noble veto, which gave the aristocrats the right to completely undo the middle class's vote. All three groups agreed on the need for fiscal and judicial reform that included a more representative form of government. But the nobles were unsurprisingly not willing to give up all the rights and privileges that they enjoyed up until now. By the time the assembly had gathered, hostilities between the three estates had erupted into near violence between the different members. The middle class, known as the Third Estate, met alone and declared themselves the National Assembly. They met in an indoor tennis court and took what would become known as the Tennis Court Oath, under which they vowed that they would not disperse until constitutional reform had been achieved. Wisely discerning which way the wind was blowing and seeing what had happened to the British at the hands of the American rebels, most of the clergy and 47 nobles joined the new National Assembly, and a begrudging King Louis XVI disbanded the Estates General and absorbed its members into the new National Assembly. Unsurprisingly, many nobles did not take this new development well at all, and King Louis XVI moved several army regiments into Paris and the surrounding countryside. Parisians feared that the king was preparing to crush the newly formed National Assembly. On July 11, 1789, the king dismissed Jacques Necker, his only non-noble minister who was popular with the people due to his advocacy for national reform. Parisians saw this as further proof that the king was going to crush their attempt at a more representative government and rioted, seizing 32,000 muskets and cannons from a military hospital and turning their sights on the Bastille and its gunpowder stores. Surrounded by angry rioters, Bernard-René Delaunay, governor of the Bastille, invited delegates from the revolutionary force to negotiate a surrender. Promising not to open fire, he greeted the men warmly as they sat to discuss terms. Yet, when the talks dragged on, the people outside grew restless and became convinced that their delegates had been imprisoned inside the infamous fort. A group of them climbed an outer wall and lowered a drawbridge, letting the horde inside the courtyard. But when they attempted to lower a second drawbridge, Delaunay ordered his soldiers to shoot, killing 100 civilians. Later, a troop of French guards, loyal to the Parisian people, laid siege to the fort with their heavy cannons, and Delaunay was forced to surrender. The former governor was marched down to City Hall and murdered, and his corpse was decapitated. His head would not be the last to roll. With their victory in Paris, revolutionary fervor swept across the nation and peasants began an open revolt. After decades of exploitation, the peasants looted and burned the homes of tax collectors, landlords, and the elite, triggering an exodus of the nobility from France. Known as the Great Fear, the revolution would go on to inspire the National Assembly to formally abolish feudalism on August 4, 1789. Known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, this bold proclamation did away with the old system of exploitation by the nobility and called for a system based on equal opportunity for all, freedom of speech, popular sovereignty, and representative government. Struggling to balance the power of the king with that of the people, the Constitution would go on to adopt a constitutional monarchy, which allowed the king to have royal veto power and to appoint ministers. This did not sit well with many of the most influential revolutionary leaders, who desired a constitution akin to that of the United States. There should be no king, they argued, and France should be a grand republic. They also demanded that Louis XVI be put on trial for his many crimes against his people. In April of 1792, the newly elected Legislative Assembly, its members voted into power by the people, declared war on Austria and Prussia, whom they believed were harboring counter-revolutionary French nobility, and in the hope that a defeat of these two major powers would further spread their revolution, exporting more democratic ideals across Europe. On August 10th, King Louis XVI was arrested by a group of radical revolutionaries who demanded that the king be put on trial immediately, both for his past crimes against the nation and for harboring secret desires to crush their new democratic legislative assembly. In September, a wave of violence swept across the nation, with the massacring of counter-revolutionaries who wanted a return to monarchic power. The Legislative Assembly was disbanded and replaced by a new national convention, which immediately declared the abolition of the monarchy and the birth of the French Republic. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI was sentenced to death for high treason and crimes against the state. He was sent to the infamous guillotine, and 9 months later, his wife, Marie Antoinette, would face the same fate. Interestingly, she never actually said the line most famously attributed to her. The myth goes that when told that the peasants were starving and had no bread to eat, the flippant and out-of-touch Marie Antoinette simply responded with, "Well then, let them eat cake." A myth is all it is, though. France's revolutionary zeal would soon go out of control, though, with a bloody reign of terror that lasted 10 months and saw thousands of suspected enemies of the revolution lose their heads. This reign of terror would itself lead to another revolution by the French people known as the Thermidorian reaction. With a severely weakened national convention and the French people pretty sick of the politicians' crap, it was decided that executive power would lie with a 5-member directory, which would be appointed by Parliament. Many protested this new regime, which were swiftly put down by the French military, now led by a very successful general. You may have heard of him, Napoleon Bonaparte. From here on out, everything worked out just fine, and there were no major problems in Europe ever again. Just kidding. The Directory proved to be a huge disaster, which relied on military force to maintain rule and paved the way for Napoleon Bonaparte to overthrow them and declare himself emperor. Then he immediately plunged the entire European continent into several wars that nearly cost France its independence. Why do you think the French had so much trouble figuring out how to make democracy work? Let us know in the comments. And as usual, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.